Hello everyone, as promised, this is part 2 for my update yesterday. This is basically everything that's been going on in Ukraine outside of the battle for Avdiivka. As discussed in the Avdiivka video, there's a great deal actually going on. For one, Ukraine is trying to counterattack in other locations, some locations that are more lightly defended, some not. The point of this being is to take pressure away from Avdiivka, redivert some Russian reinforcements to other parts of the front. So we're going to go into that first. The biggest piece of news we're actually going to cover, we're also going to talk about a couple Russian advances outside of Avdiivka. The town of Kromove, which if some of you guys will remember, is right on the outskirts of Bakhmut. I'll go ahead here and add in, I think it's this label right here, localities. There we go. So as you can see here, the town of Kromove, this was never captured by Russian or specifically Wagner forces after the fall of Bakhmut. It has just been captured by Russian forces. Russian troops broke through in the last couple days, seized control of the town. So initially, if there's some confusion here, the Russians had captured all of Bakhmut, and the Ukrainians had retreated from Kromove, but due to the positioning of this little town and where the Ukrainian main line was, the Russians must have assessed that it was a bad position. So this town was just left abandoned in the middle of the no man's land. Neither side occupied it. Eventually, during the Ukrainian counterattacks, they moved in and occupied the towns. So it's not the case that the Russians just moved into an unoccupied town. Ukrainian forces were in this town, and Russians forced them out of the town in the last 24 hours or so. The other big update that's going on here, it seems like there's actually a lot of activity on the Bakhmut front, is the Russians have pushed in and contested a very large entrenched position of the Ukrainian army. Now, this was previously contested by the Russians. If you guys will remember, the Russians had captured all the way up to a certain point near the 0506 road before the battle was over, and then some Ukrainian counterattacks ended up pushing the Russians back. I'm not entirely sure if the Russians ever occupied this position specifically right here, but it is a commanding position. It's relatively close to the top of the hill. As you can see, it's actually a little bit down below it on the other side. So it definitely appears like Russia is continuing with the pressure around Bakhmut. So before we get into any other of the Russian updates, I want to talk about what's going on with Ukrainian counterattacks concerning Avdiivka. So the big problem here is it's very similar to Bakhmut in the sense that Ukrainian supplies are being choked off, even though what you can see from this map, this is the Russian front line here. The Ukrainians don't actually control everything up to these borders. Obviously, you know, like a rifle has some range on it. There's some places, like you can see right here, you have Ukrainian trenches right here, but all this land in between is basically no man's land, right? So there's a significant no man's land buffer around the entire perimeter of the place. So the real opening Ukraine have supplies to get into Avdiivka is very narrow, just a couple kilometers. Ukrainian trenches are probably stationed along this particular what do we call them, hedgerows, or you know, forest plantations, hedgerows, whatever. This is probably where Ukrainian forces are stationed, and then of course in Sieverne. So really, you're just looking at one main road that goes through this town right here by the coke plant and supplies the entire area. And then you have Russian artillery come down on that road the whole time. So similar to Bakhmut, Avdiivka will eventually fall if this situation is not relieved. So in order to do that, Ukrainians have to take some of the pressure off, buy some time, and they're doing that by attacking the Russians where they least expect it, in the city of Gorlovka. Now, the reason why this is very unexpected, for those of you that may not know, Gorlovka has seen minimal combat compared to the rest of the country, the rest of the front line since the beginning of the war. There's been almost no big fights here. There's been a couple instances of Russian probing attacks towards New York earlier in the war, but that's to the south. Some Russian assaults going on actually slightly north of Gorlovka at this small little town here. I can't really remember the name. I guess we can open this back up and do neighborhoods. Maybe let's just do everything. It's like Mayorsk or something like that. I'm not exactly sure. I can't read the word in Spanish. It starts with an M. Anyways, there were Russian assaults in this area north of town, but in the areas of Shumy, Gorlovka, Toretsk, there hasn't been much. So the Ukrainians launch an assault, and if you could, as you can see, the terrain here is kind of rough. Most of this land that they captured was the no man's land. There was a huge buffer in here. The Ukrainians were basically stationed along this creek bed, with the Russians having control over most of these high industrial mounds throughout the area. And the Ukrainians lunged forward, captured 2 of the mounds, or I guess, yeah, we'll consider this its own mound. The Russians still hold on to this one. As you can see, there does appear to maybe be some kind of trenches, maybe some kind of fortification in the top. Of course, this is just satellite image that's been stretched to match the terrain, so it's not exact, but there probably are Russian spotters fortified up on top of that peak. But you know, it's going to be difficult for Russian troops in that position moving forward. Now, this seems a bit threatening until you start to look around to the rest of the area, and you can see this entire region, a lot of forests, a lot of these old mining mounds or disposal mounds, I guess you can say landfill mounds, that have been, you know, they're all artificial. They're not naturally there, but they make great advantage points or vantage points for spotters, for artillery, for snipers, machine gun nests, whatever you want to call it. So some Ukrainian pressure there. There's also a Ukrainian attack south of Bielogorivka towards Zolotarovka and the Verkhonokamyanka oil gas, and this is a gas plant, right? Something like that. It's been a while since we talked about Severodonetsk, but big oil refinery, I think is what that was. It's either oil or natural gas. I'm not exactly sure, but sizable chunk of land and a little bit of forested area that the Ukrainians managed to grab back from the Russian side, threatening this town right here. Another location where, you know, outside of the counterattack in Avdiivka, where the Ukrainians are trying to push, is in Robotny. There's actually some crazy combat footage here. It's not really, at first glance, you don't think it's anything unusual. It's a FPV drone footage, which I'm not going to show all of it, but just want to pause it on one part where you can see the landscape outside of Robotny is absolutely, it's an absolute nightmare. That's the only way you can describe it. It looks exactly like some of these black and white photos of World War I battles. It's really crazy. Really tough fighting going on in Robotny. A lot of vehicles and destroyed equipment strewn about everywhere. Ukrainians did manage to capture some ground there, and they're pushing back. And then finally, you have the area on the Dnieper River, where the Ukrainians have been, you know, trying to relieve pressure off of Krinky with artillery strikes, drone strikes, missile strikes on Russian forces. But Russian troops at the moment appear to have this pretty well cordoned off. It doesn't seem like the Ukrainian army has made any more advances outside of their initial push into that town. So those counterattacks probably helped. That coupled with this winter storm that happened in Ukraine probably assisted somewhat in the recapture of Stepove, which my interpretation of is basically that Russian forces in that little town there were basically shelled into oblivion from the artillery, and they were forced to exit. That after, you know, dealing with several Ukrainian counteroffensives or counterattacks trying to push back into the town. The losses it seems like from the statements made that the reason for the withdrawal from the town was the losses were too high. And that's not to take anything away from Ukraine. I'm sure there's going to be some pro-Ukraine people saying like, oh, you're just, trying to take away from the glory. No, it's either way, it's successful for Ukraine. You deal outsized casualties to the Russians, force them to leave, or you just capture the town and kill everyone in it. Either way, successful counterattack there for the Ukrainians, which is important because it does relieve a great deal of pressure on some of these logistical points like Berdichi, Orlovka, Lastochny, the last Chickney. That's, what Ukraine has been up to over the last week or so. Not a bad week for Ukraine in terms of, getting the snowstorm in their favor. Kind of gives them cover, gives them some time to get reorganized, launch some of these counterattacks, move things around. Definitely not as bad as it could have been. Now, back to Bakhmut real quick. Things are starting to get worse for Ukraine south of Bakhmut as well. It seems like the entire Bakhmut front, Ukraine no longer has an offensive advantage. There's, sporadically some word of Ukrainian attacks in the area, but for the most part, most of the gains in the last couple of weeks have been Russian. So to the south, Andriivka appears to have fallen back into Russian hands. This was the last update we got, is that Russians had captured the northern half of the town and some of the southern half of the town, and Ukrainian troops were forced to withdraw. I'm guessing either this isn't true, if this is bad information, or we're going to get an update in another day or two that the Russians have moved up and captured this creek bed here as well. But that is what's going on with Andriivka. Not a good look, because there was a lot of media. There's a big media victory when Ukraine actually managed to recapture this town, when they managed to capture this town, because this was at the tail end of the summer offensive, and a town had not been captured for some weeks until this had happened. So the most recent town that Ukraine recaptured, as far as I'm aware off the top of my head, has fallen back into Russian hands. The other issue is Klashivka. Not only have the Russians finished capturing the railroad forest plantations to the, I guess you can say this is like the northern edge of town, the Russians are now starting to push back into Klashivka. Some sources, like pro-Russian Rybar, are suggesting that several houses, or perhaps this top part of town, has already fallen into Russian hands. Don't have any proof of that. Some other sources, which are definitely more like less professional, like Russian propaganda sources, just basically random accounts that tweet Russian statements that supposedly come from soldiers on the front lines, right? So very, very low quality intel in terms of like provability or anything, but they're claiming that in the last 24 hours or so there was some big victory by the Russians in this area right here towards the top of the hill, which this is the fortified hill that looks out over top of Klashivka. So, you can clearly see this is 2014, I believe, 2014 satellite data. It might actually tell us down here at the bottom of the screen. No. Sometimes it loads up and says data attribution. Okay. Well, whatever it is, this is pretty old satellite imagery, so these fortifications have been here for a very long time, and there's probably far more here than we can actually see. So, a lot in the forests, probably new fortifications that have been built in the fields and along the top of the hill right here as well. So, we'll see in the next couple days if something actually happened there or not. But that's, just kind of the word. It follows the general trend of Ukrainian troops backtracking on the Bakhmut front. Now, there have been some other Russian gains. First of all, we have information about Russian attacks further to the north. Once again, some claims that Russians are moving in close on Sinkivka. Every time I update the map here, we'll get an update from pretty reliable sources like Syriac Maps or, some sources on Twitter or whatnot, that the Ukrainians have counterattacked and moved back into the forested area. And then, 2-3 days later, it gets reversed and the Russians have attacked. And that happens pretty much all the way across this front. So I'm not going to make any more changes to the map unless we get a wide general consensus, at least for, the area immediately around Sinkivka. Maybe perhaps some geolocated footage would be helpful. Those of you that follow me on Telegram or on Twitter, always, feel free to send me or tag me in battlefield footage with a geolocation. That would actually be very helpful. A little bit of free volunteer work. Maybe you can put it on your resume. Who knows? Anyways, until I get some definitive proof of Russian advances in this area, I'm very distrustful of information there. Finally, in the area of Novo-Mikhailivka, we have yet another Russian advance stepping even closer into the town. Some forested areas, most likely just pocked with trenches and stuff, have been taken over by the Russian side, as well as this structure right here, which at a glance appears to be maybe a transformer station, maybe a graveyard. Actually, I'm unsure. This looks like some kind of agricultural barn. This is probably a farm of some type, but these to me look like transformers, electrical transformers. Who knows what it is? I'm sure someone will tell us in the comments, but that's actually encroaching pretty close to Novo-Mikhailivka. Let me see if I can pull up previous frontline reports. This is all of the advances Russia's made since the Ukrainian summer offensive ended. So as you can see, quickly gaining on the area. This is about almost 4 square kilometers, 0.6, 2.85. So we'll just call that in total 7 there. A little chunk of land here. Also lost a bit to the north. So, definitely this seems like an immediate goal for the Russian army. Finally, we do have information in Marinka. Let's go ahead and get this off. There is, and this isn't necessarily a frontline update in terms of like a recent Russian advance. This is just geolocated footage that puts Russian forces in control of these two blocks, these final 2 blocks that connect the western part of Avdiivka to the southern industrial zone by this road right here. So if actually the Russians almost entirely control Marinka now. It's been a long time coming, a long roll, and it's still not over yet. There's still a couple blocks here, but I wouldn't be surprised if just one day randomly there was a random announcement that the town was captured, whether it be from one final Russian assault or whether it be just from the Ukrainians withdrawing from the town. I could see that happening sometime in the next few months. It will probably be big news because the announcement of the capture of a town, but it's, in my opinion, effectually under Russian control already. All right, guys, so that is pretty much it for the frontline updates for Ukraine ending out the month of November. There's a good bit of other things that we could talk about, but I think I'm going to wait until the next video update. I might just do a video update on the general situation in Ukraine after I do a couple podcasts. I have some podcast guests coming on in the next couple days, so keep an eye out for that. I guess we will say, admittedly, one thing that I should definitely note that it very unfortunately appears that I was wrong about, and honestly, this was wishful thinking on my part, but it does not look like there's any chance of a peace deal right now. I think there was a brief window for some kind of ceasefire soon after Israel started pushing into Gaza. So, at the end of October, I think there was a brief moment where There was just kind of anarchy or chaos, at least in the media and information environment. And it seemed like a lot of pressure was being placed on the U.S. government to maybe do something. Making peace in Ukraine would cut. It's basically like if you're in debt, you want to cut obligation. You want to cut spending, increase revenue, cut obligations, right? So, like in a personal finance kind of way, say that means for decreasing spending, right? You'd buy cheaper groceries, or you'd swap your car out for a car that gets better gas mileage and stuff like that. For cutting obligations, you'd cancel your HBO, your Netflix, your monthly subscriptions, right? That's obligations. And then for revenue, you'd spend all that time that you're watching TV, and you go out and drive a cab, or drive Uber for a couple hours or something, right? So like that's what you do as a person on a personal level when you're in debt. So as a country, obviously it's a little different, but it's the same basic thing. You want to decrease spending, cut obligations, and cut or increase revenue. And you can look at that not only from a monetary level, but from a political level. Like if you were to consider political power to have some kind of real relative number to it. If the Biden administration is struggling politically with all the conflict going on in the world, of course you have a big part of the Democratic Party upset with U.S. support for Israel. A lot of Democrats are especially younger Democrats, more your woke types, are very pro-Palestine. And then on top of that, you have a growing crowd in America that's unhappy with what's going on with the war in Ukraine. That puts the government in a position where they have to consider, reducing the political cost on themselves. And yeah, that was a long-winded way of saying it doesn't look like they're going to do that. So I guess we'll see. It could just be the case that the media environment has shifted to other things. A lot of times, the political pressure on the current administration might still be there. So we'll see. Hopefully, it would be very nice if there was a ceasefire at this point, at least for a month or so. And this isn't for, this, like, I'm solely just thinking about, like, the boys on the battlefield. Like, it's, war is a terrible thing. War is a very terrible thing. It doesn't look like it's going to happen, but it would be nice. So, to end that out, it looks like Ukraine is actually ramping up some recruitment efforts. There's been bits and pieces of different information, of course. Like there's been rumors and videos and photos and stuff floating around of potentially like women getting called up in Ukraine, or women getting drafted, which most countries, females are exempt from the draft, but in time of war, obviously the government is going to impose martial law, and they're going to override certain aspects of the Constitution, or change what laws they need to change in order to save the country. Of course, Russia did it in World War II, and if America was really on the back foot and getting invaded, then they would do the same thing. I would say that it's probably, if that is true, it's a step above scraping the barrel, which would be just basically like full total mobilization, like the entire country, not a man, woman, or child, is going to sit around and not contribute to the war effort. So it's basically a sign of bad times, if that is true. I'm not entirely convinced it's true that Ukraine is now drafting women, because there have been female volunteers all throughout the war, but there's been several recent cases of female bodies on the front line in Ukrainian trenches, as well as alleged captured, some Ukrainian troops that were captured were allegedly female, but there's no real proof that they're conscripted as of this moment. But the other thing that's kind of an interesting fact is there's some kind of information about new recruitment efforts. There's people suggesting that curfews imposed at night in some of the larger cities if you're caught out past curfew, you're automatically, getting picked up by the military and sent to the front line. There's also some stories about new potentially hiring private recruiting companies because of problems with recruitment, which is actually, I mean, from a economic standpoint, it's kind of smart because, private companies are incentivized by profit to, do a good job at whatever task they're doing. And if they make a profit off of every recruit they deliver, then supposedly they'll find more efficient ways to find recruits, or game the system, or something, which is the worst problem. Is maybe they get even less recruits and there's even more fraud. Who knows? But a Ukrainian recruitment drive is a sign that they're planning to continue with the war effort. So a lot of that information has come out after the fact, after I suggested there was an opportunity for peace. So that tells me that if there was, at least Ukrainian leadership sees that opportunity potentially crumbling as well, unfortunately. All right. Let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow on Telegram or Twitter. And everyone have a great rest of your day.